get her a little bit. Okay, cool.
Testing?
Yeah, she's good.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. How come on a Sunday morning when it's so beautiful outside, you're in here?
For you.
To hear me? Well, you should have stayed outside. I can insult myself, can I? As you heard, I was born, well, let me first say this. I'm going to talk about two different things today. Normally, each one of them takes me about an hour to talk about. So I'm going to only sort of skim over both topics. The first one has to do with my background, having been in Germany, living under the Nazi regime, etc. And the second is about the Israeli-Palestinian situation, about which I'm sure you, without insulting you, I don't think you know too much about if you are depending on the regular media, because it doesn't really convey what is happening on the ground. So anyway, as you heard, I was not born when I was 8 years old. But I was born in Germany, and when Hitler came to power in January of 1933, I was 8 years old. And my parents very quickly realized that living under the Nazi regime and being Jewish is not going to be a good idea. And so they tried to leave Germany increasingly more desperately. And they were willing to go anywhere in the world just to get out. When I remember hearing my parents talking about Hitler before he came to power, saying they hoped he wouldn't come to power, and after he did come to power, saying they hoped he wouldn't remain in power very long. And I didn't really think it had a whole lot to do with me, but it didn't take long before I realized that indeed it did, because just 2 months later, on Saturday, April 1st, 1933, there was a boycott of Jewish businesses all over Germany, and the purpose of the boycott was to prevent Christians to shop in Jewish stores. And it also had long-range effects, because after that, Christians were afraid to be seen shopping in a Jewish store. And my father and his younger brother had a business that my great-grandfather started in 1858, and there was a Nazi standing in front of our store, in front of all the other Jewish stores. The next major thing in my life happened in 1935. I changed schools because my parents decided I should go to this other school because the educational level was somewhat higher. And I went with my father to be enrolled, and the principal said, "I'm sorry, but Hedy cannot come to school here because you're Jewish." And my father didn't say a word, but he pointed to a pin that he always wore very proudly in the lapel of his jacket. And the principal said, "Oh, excuse me, I did not know that you are a wounded veteran of World War I. In that case, Hedy can come to school here." And when I first started in that school, I really had no problems. I didn't have any problems in the school that I attended before that. But by the second year I was in that second school, things began to happen. For instance, my classmates would no longer talk to me, or if they did say something to me, it was to call me Dirty Jew or some other such name. I had a math teacher for the last 2.5 years that I was in that school, who came to class almost every day wearing his black SS uniform. The SS were the Nazi stormtroopers, or the Nazi elite. And he also, he wore black boots, and in his right boot, he usually carried a revolver. And when he asked me questions, he would sometimes have his hand on the revolver, or at other times actually pointed it at me. And no matter what my answers were, whether they were right or wrong, he ridiculed me in front of my classmates and said, "Well, that's a Jewish answer, and we all know Jewish answers are no good." And I was so afraid of this man. Is he going to shoot me? what is he going to do? That I really had trouble learning. And even today, I have problems with simple arithmetic questions. So when you ask me questions later on, please, no arithmetic questions, because I don't want to embarrass myself. I do know that 2 and 2 is 19, right? The really major thing that in my life that happened while I was still in Germany happened in November 9th, 10th, 1938. That period has been referred to as Crystal Night, or the Night of the Broken Glass. And it was the first major act of persecution against Jews in Germany and Austria. Austria had already been annexed to Germany at that time. And what I'm going to tell you now is my experience then, which is similar to the experience of Jews wherever they lived in Germany or Austria. I left for school that morning, which was in a neighboring community, and I lived in a village in the Black Forest of Germany, southwest Germany. I left that morning for school just like any other day, and I remember it was a very cold but sunny morning. And on my way, I passed the home and office of a Jewish dentist, and all the windows in that building were broken. I didn't know why, but assumed it is because the family is Jewish. But I went on to school. Classes started punctually at 8. At about 8:30, the principal walked in, and he talked to all of us. And then he suddenly stopped, and he pointed his finger at me, the only Jewish child in the class. He said, "Get out, you dirty Jew." And I heard what he said, but I just didn't think it. He was such a nice, kind, gentle man. His daughter was one of my classmates, that he would say something like this. And so I asked him to repeat it. And he not only repeated it, but he came over and he took me by the elbow and shoved me out the door. And as I was standing out in the hall, all kinds of thoughts raced through my head, like, what did I do? Did I fall asleep? Did I not pay attention? What am I going to tell my parents? And before I could answer those questions, my classmates came out of the classroom, put on their coats or jackets. Some came over and pushed me, others shoved me. Still others called me dirty Jew and some other names. And then they all left. Where were they going? I had no idea. And so I went back in my classroom, sat at my desk, got out a book and tried to study. When a few minutes later, there was a soft knock on the door, and in came the only other Jewish child in that school, a boy by the name of Hans Stolan. Hans was a year younger than I and a grade below me, and he had the same experience as the one I just described. And so he asked me, what are we going to do? And I said, Hans, go back to the classroom, sit at your desk, and study, just like I'm doing. But Hans said, no, I'm scared. Can I stay here? And I said, sure, but please be quiet because I'm trying to study. And then he said, can I go over to the window and look out? And I said, yes, you can do that too. And Hans stood by that window maybe an hour or an hour and a half when he suddenly became very excited. And he said, come here, look. And what we saw, 4 men or boys in a row, chained to each other, chained to the ones in front of them, chained to the ones behind them, with as hitting them and urging them to walk faster. We didn't know who they were, but assumed these must be Jewish men and Jewish boys. And so we decided to call home and find out what's going on. There was a bookstore next door to the school where we used to buy our school books, and there was a phone there that we could use. And I called my mother at home, and a strange voice answered the phone and said the phone is no longer in service. I called my father at his place of work, my aunt, my grandmother, and each time the same strange voice told me the phone is no longer in service. Hans called his mother and some others, and he was told the same thing. And so we decided to leave home, for home, I should say. When I arrived at the house that I lived in, I noticed it looked differently than when I left it that morning. We had green shutters on the windows, and they were always open during the daytime. And they were open when I left that morning. but when I came back home, they were closed. I rang the doorbell, and nobody answered. The door was locked, didn't even know you could lock it. I found my mother at my aunt's house a little while later, and she told me that about 10 minutes after I left for school, some Nazis came to the home and and arrested my father. He was still in his pajamas. They didn't allow him to get dressed or even put a coat on this very cold morning. A couple of the Nazis stayed behind, and they broke all the windows and some of the furniture and some dishes. And after they left, my mother closed the green shutters because that was the only way she could secure the windows, locked the door, and ran down to my aunt's house. Without realizing, she was still wearing her nightgown, and my aunt gave her one of her dresses to her. When I arrived at my aunt's house, I saw my mother and aunt looking out of the window, and I wondered, why are they looking out the window? My mother opened the door, and she looked kind of grotesque because she wore one of my aunt's dresses, and it was way too big for her. Because my aunt was a pretty big woman, my mother was not. The reason they were looking out the window when I joined them is because they had heard that all Jewish men and Jewish boys, beginning with the age of 16, had been arrested that morning and taken to Village Hall. And you could see Village Hall from where my aunt lived, and we were hoping to see the men and boys come out of Village Hall and come back home soon. And it wasn't long after I arrived at my aunt's house that we saw a group of men and boys coming out of Village Hall that were being marched right past where my aunt lived. But in this group was my father and my uncle and many others that I knew. And it was exactly the same sight I'd seen earlier that morning. My mother practically hung me out of that second-story window and called out to my father, "We have Hedy, we're together." Whether he heard me, or heard my mother, or saw me, we didn't really know. And we watched them until they went around the bend in the road, and then were out of sight. And where were they going? When would they be coming back? There were no answers to that. And so we closed the window, sat there sort of in numb silence, when a few minutes later, there was a knock on the door, or a loud knock on the door downstairs. When my uncle was arrested earlier that morning, no one did any damage to the building. But knowing what happened where we lived, we thought, now they're coming to do the same thing here. And so my mother and my aunt and I ran up into the attic and hid in an old abandoned wardrobe. And I remember whispering to my mother, "I want to get out of here, but not just out of this wardrobe. I want to get out of Germany." And I guess the reason I said I want to get out of Germany is because I knew my parents had tried to leave Germany for many years, but had not been successful. How long were we in that wardrobe? I don't know. It seemed at the time as though I spent my entire life in there. When it was quiet for a while, we came back downstairs. There was nobody there anymore, and there was little damage done to the building where my aunt lived. And we learned later on that the people who were doing all the vandalizing, thank you, the people who were doing all the vandalizing were told to stop at noon and move on to the next village and do exactly the same thing there that they did in our village. There were many, and they probably came to my aunt's house about a minute or two before noon. There were many other things that happened that day and in the next several days. For instance, Jewish children were no longer allowed to go to school, whether it was a private or a public school. Jewish businesses that were still functioning